Welcome back to Farmers Inside Track, South Africa's most downloaded farmers podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Tembo, and today's episode is brought to you by the Red Meat Producers Organization. Today's episode unpacks collective herd health and the role of community-led defense in creating a biosecurity buffer zone. Here is my colleague Lisa Kanyavena in conversation with Dr. Stefan Steyn, who is a technical manager at Afrivet Training Services.
Thank you, Dr. Stefan, for joining us. Just to start it off, how is biosecurity changing from being managed by the government to being led by farmers themselves?
Thanks for having me today. We need to be very careful the way we use biosecurity. Biosecurity is basically a set of management and physical measures. Now, this is according to the WOA guidelines, designed to reduce the risk of introduction, establishment, and spread of animal disease, infections, or infestations within an animal population. So I think when we think about biosecurity itself, that's a lot about what comes in and out of the farming community. The type of animals, is it healthy animals, that type of thing. So from a standpoint in an outbreak situation, a lot of that responsibility is actually with the farmer, trying to protect his property, his or her property, trying to keep his animals healthy. If we look at the state's involvement in that comes a little bit later. The state is very much involved when there's a disease management area. And then most of that type of managemental barriers that they will put up would be more something like your movement control, how to quarantine the animals and things like that. And then going over, they will start then with the vaccination process. So there's always this give and take between the state and the farmer. You want to protect your livelihood. You want to make sure your animals are healthy. And then within that bigger picture of a state-controlled disease, the farmer plays its role and the government plays their role. So overall, the responsibility is very little for the government on the farm setup. If you look at the Animal Diseases Act, but the whole point is to help support the country in terms of actually getting this disease under control.
What does a biosecurity neighborhood watch look like in everyday farm life?
Because we've got large groups of people being affected and you've got a community set up. So the name is actually very indicative. It's a bunch of community members that come together to say we want a little bit more help in controlling animal movement in and out of our vicinity. A good example was a lot of the wildlife farmers up in Limpopo trying to protect their buffaloes, where they actually got the community members together and they said, together with the state vet and the police, we can't take the law into our own hands. So it's very important to have that liaison with the state as well as with the police to have a bit of a delegation of authority. So a lot of the community policing forums will help with that. It's a question of saying, okay, let's set up a checkpoint where we can say, okay, if you do not have the right type of documentation to bring animals into our community, then we'll show you a way, which is of course very difficult if you don't have police authority there. But at the very least, one can then get people to stop so the vehicles can be disinfected. So that's the typical things that people will look for, in terms of just basically the larger thing about communicating with each other and getting to a point where you actually find solutions to the problems. Every community is different, so each one will have different type of needs in terms of what they need to do. A lot of farm that's well fenced off, they might only need to get the community to do disinfection as you go into a town or onto a dirt road where all those farms are. But in a communal area that's many times next to a highway or something like that, it becomes a little bit more difficult. Then you have to focus a lot more on principles and see what you can do within that situation.
And I'm glad that you touched on checkpoints there. And I suppose it leads us to what are the common mistakes or overlooked areas farmers face when protecting shade fences or communal grazing areas?
You've got varying types of needs for each community as well. And then also just exactly the amount of shade space plays a large role. So the best thing is if you look into a community and you see, you've got shade fences, it's always better to try and keep the animals more than 20 meters apart from neighboring farms. They call it epidemiological unit, where spread can happen from one farm to another. But that does have cost implication. That does mean that you will need something like more fencing to make sure that you keep those animals away. And in an ideal situation, you'd like to build an impregnable wall that nothing can get through. The virus is spread most commonly through respiratory droplets, and it can spread quite far as well if the humidity is right and various factors play a role there. But generally, it's nose-to-nose contact, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So, that 20 meters next to the fence is kind of your buffer zone. So when you start speaking to farmers, there's small things. Yes, it's not foolproof, but there's small things that you can do, like just moving your watering trough or your feeding trough away from boundary fences. Feeding it on the inside fence. So one of the farmers' days, one of the farmers said, if you look at cattle early morning, and it's so true, like they go saying hi to each other through the fence. And if you don't have that high density of animals around the fence, then you don't get that nose-to-nose contact. They're herd animals, they're social animals. They want to stick together. So even if it's animals from a different farm, they will be curious. They will have a look. So, if you can't put a fence up and a no animal zone in that 20 meters, at least move your feeding and your watering troughs as far away from that boundary fence as you can. And then always just communicate with your neighbors. I think a lot of the times, mistake that most farmers make is they say, I've got a problem. I don't want to tell anybody because either, I'm ashamed of it. I'm stressed that I'll get into trouble, or what will people think? And they don't communicate with each other. But in a lot of these cases, you need to have good communication. You need to have a good relationship, and then you can coordinate. Even if your neighbor's farm and you guys say, okay, let's see if it's the neighbor of a neighbor that's infected. You can say, okay, if it's at all possible, let's say the camp that's next to each other, only my animals are on my camp and you don't have animals in your camp on that boundary fence. And then one can swap. You can actually run a different species on that camp next to it. But the whole point is you have to think out of the box when it comes to areas where there's a communal fence or where there's movement across, and in communal grazing areas, if at all possible, if you've got one herdsman looking after all the animals, then it's a lot more difficult. But again, if there's shared water troughs or shared feeding troughs, that's when you get a lot of your infections, and that's where you get your viral load very high. So if it is at all possible, get your herdsman with your herd of animals, get them to the one point, have a different feeding area if you are feeding extra things, watering and things. A lot of these communal animals, speak under correction, but they're very dependent on the resources available in that communal grazing area. So it's not always as possible, but it might be worth the effort to say, let's just do half a 200-liter drum. We put water in there. My neighbor's cattle and my cattle that usually graze together with one herdsman, they will aggregate around that watering point, and the other ones around the others. We need to think a little bit out of the box. The moment you have mixing of animals, that's where your danger comes in, that spread of infection, especially also if you're grazing communal lands, a large area, and we've seen that epidemiologically, that, you can actually see the virus spread along the highways because it's people moving animals. If you're actually grazing your animals very close to the highway, and I'm talking highways coming out from the Eastern Cape, from KwaZulu-Natal, Northwest, to a lesser extent Free State, try and avoid those areas where there's high traffic and there could be animals moving up and down. But we have to be very alert to what's going on and adaptable. And I think that's interesting. If you speak to one person, they'll say, no, the communal farmers won't be able to do it. It's impossible. And then you start talking to guys. I was doing a training session with communal farmers in the Potchefstroom area. And I told them, well, what stops you guys from just putting a quarantine camp up? And they actually seriously considered it, saying, okay, any animals coming in, we'll put in quarantine. We'll set out an area in that communal grazing where we can keep animals for 28 days. And that takes away a lot of the risk. If you look about dangers and mistakes, it's that what happens to the animals that come in? We don't just put them with our herd. We keep them separate for at least 28 days according to law now. We keep an eye on them to identify any diseases.
How do farmers shake new animals entering a disease-free area without causing arguments with neighbors?
The moment that you've got a disease that affects people's livelihoods, you will have some conflict arising. The only thing that will I won't say remedy it, because I don't think we'll ever be able to take that offense away. I think because everybody's scared, everybody's worried. And the moment you've got those factors in, people react to a certain extent emotionally. So in an outbreak situation, there's usually a lot of emotion involved. The main thing is just to get your communication out and educate people. Communities must know that there is a responsibility civilly and legally for us to try and control this disease from a farmer's point of view. That's the one way to go if you really want the hard approach to say, well, legally, we are obliged to make sure these animals are healthy before they come onto my farm, coming to my community, or coming into my communal grazing, because they, by law, have to actually be in quarantine, especially if they're moving around and you're not sure. And if there's certain documentations that's necessary now for the movement of animals. I mean, those animals need at least a declaration from the farmer, the owner, saying that these animals originate from a farm that's not in a disease management area or in Natal or in the Eastern Cape. And, a plus point is a health attestation saying, but we've examined these animals and they are healthy. So there are certain legal things that a community member can say, listen, yeah, but these things need to be in place to protect our community or our farming operations. And I think the best approach is that education to say, listen, if this thing comes into our community, this is the type of losses we'll be facing. This is how long it takes to get this thing sorted out. This is what it will cost us. And I think especially if you're in a communal grazing area where it's exceptionally difficult to maintain biosecurity within the different farmers' animals, I think there will be more conflict if a guy brings a sick animal in or brings a sick animal to the communal dip and it infects all the other animals. Then there's, of course, more problems. So if the community communicates that devastation of the disease and how important it is that we're building into our food safety, apart from the diesel prices and petrol prices, I mean, if we want affordable meat for December, we'll need to start looking after, our animals and make sure that we get this thing under control. There are certain incentives apart from the civil and the legal obligations from the community, but there are also certain incentives from the standpoint that, we want to protect our community, we want to serve our community, we want to do the right thing. Because the devastation of the disease, I mean, if you can't buy goats or you can't buy cattle or you can't get them into, what happens if one communal farmer gets infected? All those animals are quarantined as far as, according to our biosecurity definition, as far as the government can kind of separate them from the rest of the herds. Then you lose on your weaning. Your weaners have to stay longer. There's a lot of things that you start losing. So that type of incentive to say, okay, let's just think about this before, and this is how we're going to do it, and we agree on it, and then that conflict is easier to manage.
So besides animal health, how much does it cost when the disease spreads compared with the savings of preventing it together?
If we talked about disease in general, it's very difficult to put a rand value on it. But I mean, if you look at just the devastation that we saw during last year, when a lot of farms, we had people with 100, 200 calves that were weaned, ready to go to our feedlots, and now they are quarantined. Now, instead of going into the feedlot system, they actually kept back on the farm. So they're costing extra resources. That farmer has to now struggle to actually feed these animals, and then also they won't get the correct price for them. Now it's older animals, your grading will go down. So there's various factors like that plays a large role in controlling. So if you kept it out, I mean, you can lose up to a year's worth of feeding days where you have to feed extra to get those animals off the farm. And we've had multiple examples of that in the last year or two where we've got people that's got sheep and cattle on their farm. The cattle tests positive. They quarantine the farm, and now that guy sits with 400 weaner lambs that they can't move off the farm because of the quarantine, but none of the sheep are infected. So it's got far-reaching implications regarding that type of thing, managing the situation. In the dairies, it's even worse because you see a lot more mortalities. The guys are losing calf crops. The young calves are highly susceptible. The virus gets into the milk at high levels. And these poor young animals are high producers. They're genetically selected. At that stage, they're not producing highly, but they're genetically selected for production. They don't cope well with infection at that age. Their immune systems, hasn't seen this virus yet, and you all of a sudden then get this tiger heart syndrome where the virus actually just starts replicating inside the heart muscle and causes, basic heart attacks. And these animals never thrive. So you've got that part. So that guy loses a lot of his replacement heifers. But now also the cow itself, you've got milk production drops because the virus is, like I said, replicates very well in the udder. You've got high viral counts in the milk. So that udder gets viral mastitis. And with that and the destruction that the virus causes, There's secondary bacterial infections, and some of those cows lose all udders or lose 2 quarters. And that animal, even if you don't lose a quarter or the udder, the milk production doesn't seem to come back to the level that it was before the infection. So you're not just losing the current production of that animal, you're losing the genetics of that animal, and then you're also losing a lot of future production, whether that's calf or milk. So all those type of things just starts adding up. And then if you want to put rand values to it, just look at for general diseases, like especially worm control. If you don't do like regular deworming, you can lose up to 20% of your production because all of that energy is just going into the worms. It's never getting to a point where it's actually going into the milk or where it's actually going into actual protein for meat production. So overall, if the pawpaw hits the fan, then it's, in a general rule in life, a lot more difficult to get that pawpaw back together again.
For shared farm areas like transport routes or even handling pens, what basic biosecurity rules must everyone follow?
The moment you have shared areas, biosecurity becomes immensely difficult because you don't have physical barriers that can keep your sick animals, infected animals away from your clean or uninfected animals. They tend to use the same feeding troughs, the watering troughs, the same dip tanks, the same crawls. And a crawl overall is a very difficult thing to disinfect. The moment you've got organic matter, there's always a chance that your disinfectant, doesn't matter which one you use, won't get to that virus. So it becomes more of a type of management thing, and it will never be ideal. If you have to look at it from a biosecurity standpoint, a communal grazing community that shares the same facilities, the same grazing, they will function as a unit by themselves. So you can only try and protect that whole unit. But once the virus is in there, that's very difficult. But from a management point of view, even though it won't be ideal, there are certain things that you can try and implement. So the first thing is just to make sure that if you see a sick animal, don't take them out to pasture, or don't take them to the dip tank. Check that animal at home. If you've got a rectal thermometer, see if you can get a temperature on the animal. And if it's feverish, then keep it back. That type of thing, that's very important to separate, and then try and separate that animal away from the rest of the animals. Unfortunately, it would have been shedding virus for quite a number of days before showing clinical signs. So there will be more infections, but at least what the farmers will be doing is they will reduce the number of virus that's in the environment. And if you reduce the number of virus in the environment, that kind of just gives the animal's immune system a shot in trying to remove this virus. So it's not ideal, but it's definitely something that you can do that. The one thing I was thinking, if you've got one herdsman looking after, 2 or 3 farmers' cattle, and you've got a different herdsman looking after, 2 or 3 farmers' cattle, then just make sure that you try and keep those 2 mixed herds separate from each other. So we just organize and communicate. So that's where a lot of the difficulty comes in. It becomes effort to kind of see if we can coordinate this thing. And this isn't an ideal world. That's ideas that I'm trying, if someone's listening that thinks, yes, what can they do? That this is something that they maybe consider, because the whole idea for biosecurity is to keep your clean animals clean and your dirty animals separate. So you don't have your lines that cross. If you use a specific road towards the dip tank, maybe consider doing a different road so that you can do certain herds one down the one road. There's cost implications, things like that. But I think farmers need to think out of the box, especially when it comes to handling pens and communal areas like dip tanks, crushers and things like that. And of course, the moment that you're done working with a certain group of animals, so if you're used to taking your animals to the dip tank on Tuesdays and your friend takes them on Wednesdays, then in between that Tuesday and that Wednesday is disinfect what you can disinfect. Like I said, crawls are difficult to disinfect, but the stuff that you can disinfect them. The people working the cattle, like if you have an animal health technician or the farmer, whatever, between groups of cattle, definitely hand washing and sanitization, or just glove changes at the very least. But it is important to kind of, if you've got a sick animal and then you're mouthing animals, you can very easily spread the virus from one to the other. Makes biosecurity, if you don't have the perimeter fencing, it becomes challenging, but it does show us that the importance in the South African context of the role that vaccination can play. So I usually tell people, we've got 3 support structures in disease control. You've got your movement control, you've got your vaccination, and you've got your biosecurity. If your biosecurity and your movement control is a little bit weak, then at least you can fall back on your vaccination. And I think in terms of communal grazing, that's one of the most important parts to get vaccinated, because those are the guys that we struggle with biosecurity due to the nature of the farming system as well as movement control, because it's very difficult to stop every animal down the N6 or down the N1 and say, oh, you can't. So then your backup plan, the vaccination, becomes your pillar.
And from what you've shared so far, Dr. Stefan, it's quite clear that farmers cannot work in silos and that unity is power. So how can farmers encourage their neighbors to follow movement and safety rules?
I think, again, like we say, it's all communication. The community has to, like you said, function as a group. They need to decide what their commitment is to the common good, the common goal of that community. What helps a lot is if you do have farmers organizations or larger organizations like the RPO or your local farmers collaboration or farmers association that can help coordinate that. Because, if there's a little bit of structure or someone's willing to take the lead, people tend to see the importance of that and to see that they can actually have a chance of keeping their community clean. The difficulty is always, to motivate people enough to say, okay, let's do this. I think we're getting into a state where we're going to have to put our own interest aside to a bit and put our communities first, because within 2 or 3 weeks, you can't sit back and say, oh, well, it's happened to my neighbor. I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to work with anybody, because within a month, you could be the neighbor that all of a sudden is under quarantine. And I think that the communal sympathy or empathy should be a very strong incentive to get people to do that. But again, it is our civil and legal obligation. You can be prosecuted under the Animal Diseases Act if you do not follow, especially movement rules set apart by the Directorate of Animal Health. So clear communication between the community members and your state vet. The state vets are invaluable in this setup because they know the communities, they spend time with the community, they know the ins and outs and the difficulties that they face. So they tend to come up with interesting ideas as well about how, because they feel responsible for the areas that they're in. And the quicker they can keep those areas clean, the less paperwork for them on the one side. But of course, also then it's the community is happier. So involve the state veterinarian, involve your organizations, civil organizations to help with that. Because I think at the end of the day, we can have nice incentives, but you don't want to go threaten people. I always feel like if you can motivate and educate people, then it's much easier to buy in than to just threaten people with the law. But according to the Animal Diseases Act, it is the responsibility of the farmer or the manager or the owner of that area or the combined of the community to help in the control of the disease. And that is especially with movement control and the documentation required.
And speaking of RPO, what role does the RPO play in helping farmer groups create safe zones, and how do they help map disease-free areas?
I'm personally not associated with the RPO, so, if I comment too much, I might just do them an injustice, because I think they're doing a lot behind the scenes as well. I think they also do help a lot with education. The RMIS also helps a lot with education and support. So I think the whole idea with any type of association that actually supports producers, they play a key role in that coordinating of events, reporting of disease, so they become kind of like the link between the community and the state. So it's a very important relationship to have, because they can also then look after the economic interests. That's what I suspect if I see the things that they are doing. The talks that I've listened to from a variety of their leadership, it's about just trying to find a way through this whole outbreak and trying to keep the interest of the producer high up in the level of the government so that they know what's going on. And I know they're in constant communication with the Department of Agriculture as well. I think they also played a role finding a vaccine. There's a variety of industries that are at this stage trying to help the industry that's lobbying for the farmer, and then from there on helping with the identification. A good example of just the way that especially now the RMIS has helped the farmers is if you go onto their website, you can download the documentation you need to fill in to move animals. It's small things like that that can make a big impact. When it comes to just that disease areas, if you've got your local producers reporting into a region with an RPO representative, that community, that region can basically translate it into a heat map saying that, okay, I've got so many farmers. These are the amount of cattle in my area. This is the number that's infected. So that also helps a lot with the epidemiological tracing of the disease spread. And that type of thing, if you know where your things are going and how things are spreading, you can actually trace it back to the source and also trace it forward to see where there might be the next difficulty. So overall, those type of organizations play a big role in representing the producers, but also then feeding back into the community and sponsoring farmers' days, educating the farmers, organizing with people that they educate. I'm sure that they do have a section that actually helps with education as well. But like I said, I think they do a lot more that I'm aware of. And I think under these circumstances, whether it's the RPO or the RMIS or a variety of other organizations, they're working hard in the background trying to keep our producers competitive, making sure we've got access to markets, making sure that they've got access to vaccines and things like that.
When it comes to young herders who see the animals every day, how are they trained to spot early signs of the disease?
When it comes to training, it is the responsibility of that owner or that manager or that farmer. Not just the responsibility, but I think it's to the benefit of that farmer or owner to actually train their herdsmen, because you can actually catch a lot of diseases very early and also increase them just the turn to health if you catch a disease early. So if I use the Afrivet Training Services model as an example, we do a variety of collaborations with universities, with state-owned entities, and we go and we train co-op members, we train farmers, we do farmers' days, we do these collaborations where universities invite us to upliftment programs where we actually take our farmers through that early disease identification and primary animal health so that they can identify at least what might be going on. We usually have them in 5 categories, and then they can go to their closest co-op or animal health technician or vet or state vet and ask, I think this is what's going on. I need this and this and this. That helps a lot as well. We do a lot of work with the co-ops. We have good relationships with all our major co-ops where we do yearly training of the animal health, people that's on their animal medicine section, where we teach them also early disease identification, so that when there's a question that's coming from a farmer, they'll be able to at least supply them with the correct medication or at least help support that animal until a vet can get there. And also for them to identify, okay, now I need a vet, or now I need to spend money, or now I need to send this animal to the abattoir. That's the type of things that we would call that type of in-person training. And then, with the internet these days, you do have access to a lot of opportunities online to get that training. We also have an online platform, Afrivet Academy, where people can do that type of courses and just help them identify what could be the main causes of disease without it necessarily. The problem is if you don't see the animal, it's very difficult to get a diagnosis, but you can treat symptomatically until you can get to a diagnosis. And that's what we're trying to empower our clients with, is to say, okay, but if you do see this signs, make sure it's not this, or you can support the animal in this way while you get to the vet, or keep that animal going until a vet or an animal health technician arrives. So that's the typical things that you can see. The RMIS has done a collaboration with us where we did a video series on biosecurity on farm level, and that's available on their website, for instance. So the possibilities are there. It just becomes, whether that herdsman wants to actually increase in his education, whether he wants, to thrive in his job. And then also just having access to that as far as, a manager or an owner or a farmer can provide. Because I do think a good example is something like pneumonia. If you catch a pneumonia very early, the chances of you losing that animal, it drops by 70% if you catch it within the first 12 hours of the fever. So, it's small things that can make a large difference to a farming setup.
Lastly, Dr. Stefan, if a community wants to set up a disease buffer zone immediately, what are the first steps they should take altogether? Maybe give us 3.
It's difficult because, again, if you don't have physical type of barriers, the state at the moment already, they've got their hands full declaring a lot of the disease management areas because there's not necessarily a physical barrier. But I think the first thing is the community needs to get together and decide what are their goals. Because if everybody knows what they're working towards, then it's much easier to kind of hammer a plan into existence. And then they'll also know what input they'll need from the state vet and from the police. So that will definitely have to show the involvement. I think with those entities, we tend to be resilient towards the state sometimes. And I think that's unfair. At the end of the day, the state lacks hands. And I know we don't have to go into any of the causes for that. But, you see the animal health technicians and the state veterinarians working very hard. Long hours, long days. And I think they appreciate it when communities stand up and say, okay, we'll have a checkpoint and we'll check movement of animals. We just need authority to do that. So that's the type of thing. So I think when you've gathered the community and identified a leadership group, take your plan to your state vet as well as to your police officers and see where you can help. And when you've decided on how big your buffer zone you want your buffer zone to be, then you can start looking at having controlled access, see where the whole idea is just to identify areas where there will be a lot or a high incidence of the disease. Like if you've got a highway coming through in the community, say, okay, our buffer zone is that area next to the highway. No animals go there until we've got this thing under control, that type of thing. So you need to look at where's your chances of getting the infection the easiest and trying to build your buffer zone within that. And then as people come into your vicinity or into the community, decontaminate the vehicles with the disinfectant, so whether that's a tire bath coming through and then a spray would be possible, do that. The best place to actually try and limit access at the kraals. Don't have, strange people coming into the kraals or vehicles driving on road that your animals walk. There's no virus being shed from the vehicles. It's going to be very community specific. But then as a community, they can also say, the best thing we can do is vaccinate. So be in contact with your local state vet and ask them whether it's possibility to start vaccinating around or start vaccinating cattle that's kept in a communal area. Because that's the one thing that even if you do miss a car coming through or your buffer zone fails, and there's always roads and things, you can't man all the roads all the time, that at least you've got that backup, you've got some antibodies that will at least lessen the disease. I wish I could give you a step 1, do this, step 2, do this. But unfortunately, if we follow a set recipe, we're definitely going to fail because we've got, varying communities have very different needs and very different access points. But it's all about movement control and access, who has access to where, because you want to keep the dirty world out and you want to keep your clean herd safe from that.
And that was Dr. Stefan Steyn, who is a technical manager at Afrivet Training Services. This is Farmers Inside Track, and this episode was brought to you by the Red Meat Producers Organization. Thank you for listening and keep growing with us.